Hello, and thank you for making time to attend this presentation on the EU Cyber Resilience Act. This presentation will provide you with a short introduction to the EU Cyber Resilience Act, or CRA, that is coming into full effect from December 2027. As a new piece of CE marking legislation, it has a broader scope than any previous CE marking regulation and will affect many products being placed on the EU market. The agenda for this presentation will be as follows. We'll begin with an introduction, just explaining at a high level what the CRA is and what its requirements are. Next, we'll look at the scope of the CRA, understanding what kind of products are actually covered by the CRA. Then we'll look at manufacturer obligations, things that manufacturers have to do in accordance with this regulation. Then we'll look briefly at the enforcement and penalties mentioned by the regulation before looking at some next steps that manufacturers could take to prepare themselves for the incoming deadline. Let's begin with an introduction to the CRA. What is it? What products does it affect? What are its requirements? The CRA is a piece of EU legislation which covers rules for the placing on the EU market for products with digital elements. We'll look at what products with digital elements means on the next slide. As a regulation, the CRA is automatically law in the EU member states, and the goal of the CRA is to improve the level of product cybersecurity in the EU, and the requirements are all focused on cybersecurity. Like other CE marking legislation, it defines a scope of products that it affects, the requirements for those products, requirements for the key economic operators involved, and details of how manufacturers can meet the product requirements, the conformity assessment procedures. Because the CRA has a very wide scope, covering both high and low risk products, different routes for demonstrating conformity are available for different categories of products. We won't explore that in too much detail in this presentation, but regardless of which route a manufacturer takes, there will likely be a need for testing, assessments, or other evidence. Over the next 2 years, around 40 new standards are being developed to support the CRA. We won't need to cover them all, but this gives you an idea of how big the CRA is. Furthermore, the CRA is different to other CE marking legislation in two key respects. First, it doesn't just apply to products at the point they are placed on the market. The CRA imposes requirements that cover the product lifecycle, including the development process and ongoing support such as security updates. Second, the CRA introduces reporting obligations, where manufacturers have to report certain cybersecurity incidents to authorities, and these obligations even affect products which were on the market before the CRA comes into effect. So, what is a product with digital elements? The CRA defines this term as meaning any product involving digital data, including hardware devices and software products, such as apps. It also covers remote data processing solutions for these products, which means the CRA also affects the cloud. The CRA then applies to products with digital elements if they make data connections with other devices or networks. This means a product with digital elements that doesn't connect to anything else would be out of scope, such as a calculator or a digital stopwatch. If these were smart products, though, that can connect to the internet or to a smartphone, then they would be in scope. The CRA isn't the only piece of EU legislation that deals with the topic of cybersecurity. That said, it aims not to duplicate the cybersecurity requirements of other legislation, and therefore there are some key interactions with other regulations that are worth noting. For example, the Radio Equipment Directive delegated regulation on cybersecurity requirements for radio equipment will be repealed as of 11 December 2027. This will avoid overlap between the requirements of that regulation and the CRA. Also, certain product types covered by other pieces of sectoral legislation are outright excluded, such as medical devices, type-approved vehicles, aviation safety, and marine equipment. There is also an interplay with the EU AI Act and the Machinery Regulation that both touch on cybersecurity requirements for their respective products. Therefore, products in scope of the AI Act or the Machinery Regulation may well have to comply with both pieces of legislation. So what are the actual requirements of the CRA on these products with digital elements that are covered by it? Well, these are the essential cybersecurity requirements outlined in Annex 1 of the regulation. And broadly, these can be grouped into two sets of requirements. The first group, the requirements for products, outlined in Part 1 of Annex 1, are the product requirements, covering the secure design, development and production, including risk assessment, and then the actual technical requirements for the products themselves. The second group, covered in Part 2 of Annex 1, are the vulnerability handling requirements, and these can be thought of as process requirements on the manufacturer themselves, as opposed to on each individual product with digital elements. Again, there are basically two groups of requirements here. The first is on producing what's called the software bill of materials and identifying vulnerabilities in the product based on that. The next group of requirements is around the topic of identification and remediation of vulnerabilities, that is to say, a vulnerability handling process. So let's take a closer look at the essential requirements on the products themselves, those covered in Part 1 of the Annex 1 to the CRA. So here we have 14 requirements. These are the technical requirements for the product, starting with secure development based on the risk assessment, and then looking at topics such as not having known exploitable vulnerabilities, a secure by default configuration, providing security updates, authorized access, confidentiality and integrity protections for data, as well as minimization of data, availability protection or protection from denial of service and other interruptions, and looking at protection of external services or networks that could be affected by the product with digital elements. There's also a general requirement to limit attack surfaces, reduce the impact of incidents, record and monitor, and then have a secure deletion mechanism so that users can securely delete personal data. These requirements, or many of them, are familiar to those who have been looking at the Radio Equipment Directive and its requirements for product cybersecurity, but there are a couple of new areas as well. And now looking at the Part 2 or process requirements around vulnerability handling, you can see there are 8 essential cybersecurity requirements outlined in this part of the CRA. The first one is around identifying and documenting vulnerabilities and components, the so-called SBOM or software bill of materials. The remaining requirements then outline a process for receiving and handling notifications or reports of vulnerabilities related to the product and remediating them, for example, by distributing updates. Aside from the essential cybersecurity requirements outlined in Annex 1 of the Cyber Resilience Act, there is also the Annex 2, which contains information and instructions to the user requirements. Now, this is important because this could be overlooked given that these requirements will not be covered by standards or the conformity assessment procedures themselves, although it's worth noting that this information does need to form part of the technical documentation that supports conformity assessment and declaration of conformity with the CRA. So fundamentally, this annex outlines the key information that accompanies a product with digital elements, and that includes manufacturer details or details of who the manufacturer is, vulnerability reporting contact details to support those vulnerability handling processes. Where do people report vulnerabilities to? Also, it's important to note the intended purpose and also the environment and other conditions that supports the security position of the product with digital elements, as well as any important information related to the security and achieving the optimum security or intended security position. An important topic here is also that the end date of the product support period has to be publicized and provided to the user, and therefore this end date needs to be defined as well. We'll talk about that in a later slide as well. Also, there is no requirement for the manufacturer to make available their software bill of materials, or SBOM, but if they do decide to make that available, then it's required to share information of where to actually find that. Now, here's a timeline of some key dates in the story of the CRA. So it was actually first published back in 2024, and the standards work began in early 2025. Throughout 2025 and into 2026, there's been a lot of work on producing the 40 or so standards to support manufacturers in demonstrating compliance with the CRA. Critical dates then are the upcoming 11th of September 2026, when the manufacturer reporting obligations come into effect. And then the big deadline is the 11th of December 2027, when the CRA will be fully in force. This means that manufacturers actually have obligations to be aware of from September 2026. The majority of standards to support compliance with the CRA are expected from summer 2026. However, the deadline for the main horizontal standard, which will cover the majority of products, will not be available until late 2027. This means we can expect the focus in 2026 will be on requirements related to the reporting obligations, product design and development, and vulnerability handling. As we get into 2027, so we'll see more look at and more focus on the actual technical requirements and meeting the essential cybersecurity requirements of the CRA. So now let's take a closer look at the scope of the CRA and what kinds of products are actually covered by it and which products are not. So thinking back to the term products with digital elements, its definition means that the scope of the CRA is actually very broad. All kinds of hardware products are covered, such as IoT devices and their components, such as microprocessors and wireless modules. It doesn't matter how these devices connect to each other. It can be using wireless technology or just cables. Software products are also in scope, which is a really big impact of the CRA. For the first time, pure software products may now be CE marked, and all kinds of software products will be in scope, especially apps that connect to the internet or work together with IoT products. Remote data processing solutions are also covered, but only when related to a hardware or software product that is in scope. Imagine a smart home automation solution. The various sensors and control devices are hardware products that are in scope of the CRA. The mobile app the homeowner uses to see what the sensors are reading or to control things around the home is also in scope. The backend service in the cloud that enables the homeowner to use the app while they're away from their home is also covered by the requirements as a remote data processing solution. There are some important exclusions to the CRA scope. As with other regulations, non-commercial products are out of scope. The CRA also doesn't apply to standalone software services or web-based apps such as online banking platforms, email services, and AI tools that don't require the user to download any software. The most important exclusions are vehicles and automotive components covered by the vehicle type approval requirements and medical devices. These products are covered by other regulations that include their own cybersecurity requirements. For the products that are in scope, these can be grouped into 5 product categories. The so-called default category, which actually consists of, depending on who you talk to, up to 90% of the market. And then you have the important products, which is divided further into class 1 and class 2, and the critical products. So as you can see, there is actually an increase in perceived risk related to these categories. And the result of these categories is that depending on which category a product with digital elements falls into, the effect is on the available conformity assessment procedures that the manufacturer can use to demonstrate conformity with the essential cybersecurity requirements. Essentially, the more critical or risky a product with digital elements is, so the more onerous the conformity assessment procedure becomes. Finally, there is the free and open source software category, which is a very big topic in itself, which I won't go into too much detail in this presentation. But the main takeaway here is that free and open source software, if it is in scope of the CRA, is treated very much similarly to the default category in terms of the conformity assessment procedures. So looking at the important products class 1 category, this contains 19 quite specific categories of product, and each product is defined by a specific set of functionalities or a core functionality. So for example, a product that is intended to be antivirus software, for example, is clearly an important product class 1. So too would be things such as boot managers, operating systems, routers, modems, and switches, or security-related microprocessors and microcontrollers. What's important to note here is that a product is defined as an important product or any other product category based on its core functionality. So if we take, for example, a network router, its core functionality is as a router. Now, it might also incorporate other functions, such as a firewall, or contain within it a hardware security module. Those additional functions or components do not themselves affect which product category the product with digital elements falls into. It is purely based on its core function. Class 2 of important products then are, you could say, higher risk or more critical than the important Class 1 products. And these includes things such as firewalls, tamper-resistant microprocessors, and tamper-resistant microcontrollers. So these products are considered a higher risk or more critical than the important products Class 1. And compared to important products Class 1, these products generally have to go through a notified body or a third party in order to demonstrate conformity with the essential cybersecurity requirements. And finally, the most critical product category is the critical products, which is a special class of products with digital elements that have perhaps the highest risk associated with them in terms of cybersecurity. These are special products, and many of them may well have been subjected to other schemes such as common criteria. And in fact, there is an intention by the EU Commission that they may allow these products to demonstrate conformity with the CRA by use of schemes such as common criteria. At the moment, that isn't in place yet, but as and when a implementing regulation is published that describes how to do this, so that option will become available. In any case, these products also require a third party, such as a notified body, to demonstrate conformity with the essential cybersecurity requirements. It's worth noting that for all of these important and critical products, technical descriptions are provided in an additional Commission implementing regulation that was published at the end of 2025, which provides more detail and examples of what kinds of products fall into which category. Here is a list of standards that's being produced to support the CRA. These standards outline how the various products with digital elements can demonstrate conformity with the essential cybersecurity requirements. The majority of these are vertical standards, that is, they apply to specific categories of products with digital elements and outline specifically for that category how they can demonstrate conformity with the essential cybersecurity requirements. There are also some horizontal standards that will mainly be applicable to the default category products, but will also be referenced by the various verticals as is appropriate. Now let's take a look at the obligations of manufacturers under the CRA. The CRA outlines quite a lot of obligations for manufacturers, and these are largely described in Article 13 of the CRA. Fundamentally, manufacturers have an obligation to place compliant products on the market. That means that not only are these products designed and developed in accordance with the essential cybersecurity requirements, but that the manufacturers take the necessary actions to be able to demonstrate when necessary that these products really have conformed with the essential requirements. This means carrying out and documenting their risk assessment, undergoing the necessary conformity assessment procedures, and producing the technical documentation, including the software bill of materials. They also need to conduct due diligence when integrating components, especially when not all components themselves may be in scope or in compliance with the CRA, but the ultimate goal for the manufacturer is that the product with digital elements that they're placing on the market is in compliance with the CRA. There is also an ongoing obligation to manage vulnerabilities and reports of vulnerabilities that are made to that manufacturer, and also the reporting obligations that I will talk about in a later slide. Another important action is the manufacturer must determine and communicate the support period for the product with digital elements, and that information should be available to users at the point of placing on the market so that they can make decisions around purchasing products based on that support period. And typically the support period should be at least 5 years, unless it is well understood and documented and justified that the intended use period for this product with digital elements is less than 5 years. There is also an obligation to ensure that security updates remain available for the product with digital elements for at least 10 years after placing on the market. This, in theory, is usually freely available, and so this does have an economic implication as well for manufacturers. In addition, all the usual CE marking requirements apply, such as providing user information instructions as detailed in Annex 2 of the CRA, ensuring the products themselves are identifiable and the manufacturer identifies themselves, and of course the drawing up of an EU declaration of conformity and affixing the CE mark. In some cases, other economic operators that may not naturally think of themselves as the manufacturer will actually be considered as the manufacturer and subject to the manufacturer's obligations. And this will happen when the product is marketed under someone else's name or trademark. So if an importer puts their own name or trademark on the product and sells it as their product, they then assume the role of the manufacturer from the perspective of the CRA. Also, a economic operator that modifies the product with digital elements in a substantial manner and then places it on the market is also to be considered as the manufacturer. Now, a substantial modification is considered a modification that somehow changes the security posture of that product with digital elements. Maybe it affects the conformity of the product with the essential cybersecurity requirements, changes or modifies its intended use or its foreseeable use. So these various obligations of the CRA don't just apply at the point of the product being placed on the market or in the lead up to that. Manufacturers need to consider compliance with the CRA throughout a product's life cycle, from design and development through to aftermarket support and the ongoing obligations to manage and report cybersecurity issues. It all starts with a risk assessment, which then informs how the manufacturer goes on to comply with the requirements. For example, the risk assessment might identify that the product doesn't communicate any sensitive or personal data, and therefore the requirements related to secure communication may not apply. This diagram actually illustrates that logic quite well and is taken from the Blue Guide on implementation of EU legislation. It's not a new diagram, but I think under the CRA it becomes particularly relevant. Understanding that the CRA has quite a lot of essential cybersecurity requirements, and these are not necessarily all applicable to all products with digital elements, one of the outputs of the mandatory risk assessment is that the manufacturer can justify which essential requirements are applicable or not, and then based on that only actually address how they're going to conform with those applicable essential cybersecurity requirements. So the manufacturer reporting obligations is a special set of obligations that comes into force on the 11th of September 2026. And actually, these obligations will apply to products that are on the market already before the CRA comes into effect, as well as after the product finishes or passes its designated support period. So the CRA outlines in its Article 14 a timeline where when a manufacturer becomes aware of an actively exploited vulnerability in their product with digital elements, they must submit a set of notifications and information to ENISA, which is the coordinating body for cybersecurity in the EU, and the CSIRT, or Computer Security Incident Response Team, that is responsible for the member states where their product is placed. Ultimately, it culminates in a 14-day period after which they must submit a final report that includes a description of the actively exploited vulnerability and available corrective measures. A similar timeline is also outlined for when a manufacturer becomes aware of a severe incident. The key difference here being that the manufacturer gets a month to submit the final report. For the purposes of these reporting obligations, a definition of incident is given, and this is taken from the NIS2 directive. An event compromising the availability, authenticity, integrity, or confidentiality of stored, transmitted, or processed data, or of the services offered by or accessible via network and information systems. And an incident is considered severe if it can negatively affect or is capable of negatively affecting the ability of a product with digital elements to provide the availability, authenticity, integrity, or confidentiality of sensitive or important data or functions, or it has led or is capable of leading to the introduction or execution of malicious code in the product with digital elements. So we can perhaps visualize that with the example here. So here we have a product with digital elements, and somewhere lurking inside it is a vulnerability. At some point, a malicious actor comes along, finds and exploits that vulnerability. Once the manufacturer becomes aware of this, then they report that to ENISA and the relevant CSIRT. Alternatively, an incident occurs, and this could arise from a number of sources, for example, a third-party vulnerability report or internal analysis based on ongoing routine security activities that the manufacturer undertakes on their product with digital elements. In any case, once they become aware of this incident, then they need to determine, is it severe or not? If it is severe, then they need to report that to ENISA and the relevant CSIRT. But if it's not severe, there's no requirement to report it. However, they may want to follow their normal vulnerability handling processes to remediate said incident. The question then is, how does a manufacturer actually submit these reports? So Article 16 of the CRA outlines that ENISA must establish a single reporting platform for doing this, and this reporting platform will be provided to each member state or CSIRT with their own electronic notification endpoint, effectively a website, where manufacturers can make their reports, and then the CSIRTs and ENISA can coordinate the information of those reports using this same platform. Now, the platform is expected to be online by 11th of September 2026, although right now it's not currently available. So it's important to look out for information on this single reporting platform whenever it becomes available. In order to make a report, a manufacturer then also needs to know to which CSIRT they must actually report these incidents and which member states the product with digital elements has been made available in. So the next question is, which CSIRT should the report be made to? For manufacturers who are based in the EU, the primary way of determining which CSIRT should be reported to is that it is the CSIRT of the member state where the manufacturer has a presence and where that presence is where the decisions related to cybersecurity of its products with digital elements are predominantly taken. If such a member state cannot be determined, for example, though the manufacturer has an EU presence, the location where those decisions related to cybersecurity are made is not in the EU, then instead it's the member state where the manufacturer has the highest number of employees. And that member state's CSIRT is the one that the manufacturer makes their reports to. For manufacturers outside of the EU who have no establishment in the Union, then it's slightly more complicated. The first port of call is the member state in which the authorized representative acting on behalf of the manufacturer of the highest number of products with digital elements is established. If the manufacturer does not have an authorized representative, then they could look to the importer that's placing on the market the highest number of products. And the member state where that is happening would be the one whose CSIRT the report is made to. If that cannot be established, then it's the member state in which the distributor is making available on the market the highest number of products with digital elements that the manufacturer has. And if that cannot be established, then it's simply the member state in which the highest number of users of products with digital elements are located. So it's important to understand where the products with digital elements are being placed on the market or where the users are. Once the CRA comes into full effect from 11th of December 2027, it will of course be mandatory for manufacturers of products with digital elements to meet their various obligations as outlined in the previous slides. That said, the CRA does outline certain enforcement and penalties related to non-compliance with the CRA. Chapter 5 of the CRA in particular outlines the market surveillance activities, and these will be largely coordinated between the various member states, ENISA, the CSIRTs, and the administrative coordinators or ADCOs. This is not unlike other CE marking regulations and directives. Chapter 7 then outlines penalties for continued non-compliance. Although the actual rules are defined by each individual member state, it's worth noting that administrative fines are outlined, and there are also certain other repercussions, such as product being withdrawn from the market or recalled, should a product continue to be found to not comply with the requirements of the CRA. So considering everything that's come before this point, or up until now, there is a lot to take in. So on the next slide, I will suggest some possible next steps that manufacturers could take to prepare themselves for the oncoming CRA coming into effect. So with the first set of obligations coming into effect being the reporting obligations, which will be effective from the 11th of September 2026, it would make sense for manufacturers to focus on preparing for this first. As identified or mentioned in the previous slide, I think the key actions here would be to, first of all, identify which products with digital elements are already on the EU market and identify which CSIRTs would be applicable or would be the ones to which the notifications need to be made. And that's based on the logic outlined in Article 14 of the CRA or indeed the previous slides. And keep an eye out for the information on the single reporting platform so that if a notification needs to be made, the manufacturer is fully equipped to understand which products and where to make that notification and how. As we get closer to 11th of December 2027, that more focus will need to be made on the products with digital elements themselves and compliance with the essential cybersecurity requirements. The first steps to doing this would be to obviously to identify which products with digital elements will be in scope and therefore will be under the responsibility of the manufacturer from 11th of December 2027. This could include products that are currently being placed on the market now and will still be being placed on the market after that point, or it could be products that are currently in development and will be launched either before or after the 11th of December 2027. Once those products are identified, the first thing to do is to conduct the product risk assessment, and that will allow the manufacturers then to define an approach to compliance with the essential cybersecurity requirements, identifying which essential cybersecurity requirements actually apply, and then perhaps which standards or specifications will be applied, and indeed some of the specifics around that implementation. It's also a good time to start identifying components and building the software builds materials early, and to start talking to suppliers early, because the requirements for due diligence, of course, on the suppliers will aid in manufacturers ultimately achieving compliance with the essential cybersecurity requirements of their products with digital elements. Finally, there's a need to put in place vulnerability handling processes for the manufacturer themselves. And these processes will enable them to accept and handle reports of vulnerabilities in their products with digital elements, and indeed to do this in a way that is compliant with the CRA's requirements, in particular the Part 2 requirements of Annex 1, the process requirements on vulnerability handling. And that concludes this presentation on introducing the EU Cyber Resilience Act, or CRA. Thank you for watching.